The illusion of control is often the most dangerous form of deception, not because it blinds others, but because it convinces the one who holds it that everything is unfolding exactly as planned. In the quiet, carefully arranged space of her apartment, Sheila moved with a precision that bordered on ritual, every gesture deliberate, every detail calculated to create the appearance of warmth, intimacy, and normalcy. The soft glow of candlelight reflected against polished surfaces, the table set with an almost obsessive symmetry, the faint aroma of a carefully prepared meal lingering in the air. Everything was designed to disarm, to soften, to lull. Yet beneath that curated serenity was something far colder, something sharpened by obsession and control. For Sheila, this was not simply a romantic evening. It was a confrontation disguised as affection, a test disguised as a gift, and most importantly, a moment where truth would be forced into the open whether it was welcomed or not. Deacon entered this space unaware of the tension coiled beneath its surface, carrying with him a rare sense of ease that had become increasingly unfamiliar in his life. The burdens he had carried for so long, mistakes, regrets, fractured relationships, seemed, at least for a fleeting moment, to loosen their grip. He allowed himself to sit, to breathe, to exist within the illusion Sheila had constructed, not recognizing that the comfort he felt was precisely what made him vulnerable. There was no suspicion in his movements, no guarded hesitation. If anything, there was a quiet gratitude, a belief that perhaps, against all odds, something stable could still be salvaged from the chaos that had defined their past. It was in that fragile space, where expectation had been softened and defenses lowered, that Sheila chose to reveal the truth, not with explosive anger, but with a chilling calm that made her words far more unsettling. She did not accuse, she exposed. She did not shout, she dissected. The knowledge of Deacon's connection to Taylor was laid bare with a precision that suggested not only awareness, but surveillance, calculation, and time. Every detail she revealed carried with it the implication that she had been watching, waiting, allowing the situation to develop to a point where confrontation would be most effective. The warmth of the room shifted instantly, the illusion collapsing under the weight of what had been revealed. Deacon's reaction was not immediate panic, but something more complex, a tightening of resolve, a recognition that the moment he had hoped to avoid had finally arrived. He understood Sheila well enough to know that this was not simply about jealousy or betrayal. It was about control, about ownership, about the refusal to accept a reality that did not align with her desires. When she presented her ultimatum, it was framed not as a request, but as an inevitability. Cut ties with Taylor, submit to constant surveillance through a tracking device, surrender autonomy in exchange for safety, or face consequences that were left deliberately undefined, yet unmistakably severe. The choice, in her mind, was not a choice at all. What made Deacon's refusal so significant was not its defiance, but its clarity. He did not hesitate, did not negotiate, did not attempt to soften the confrontation. In that moment, he chose something that had eluded him for much of his life: self-respect. He rejected the idea that love could be conditioned on submission, that freedom could be traded for security, that his identity could be reduced to something controlled and monitored. It was not just a refusal of Sheila's demands, it was a rejection of everything she represented. And in doing so, he unknowingly crossed a line that Sheila had already decided could not be uncrossed. The shift in Sheila was immediate and absolute. The controlled calm that had defined her earlier demeanor fractured, revealing something far more volatile beneath. Anger, for her, was not chaotic. It was focused, directed, purposeful. She did not lash out impulsively. She acted with a speed and efficiency that suggested preparation. The confrontation, it became clear, had never been contingent on his compliance. It had been designed to justify what she was already prepared to do. Deacon's resistance did not alter her plan, it activated it. What followed was swift and brutal, a transition from psychological control to physical domination that left no room for resistance. Deacon, despite his strength and instinct, was caught off guard by the intensity of her response. The environment that had once seemed safe became a trap, every element of comfort revealing itself as part of a larger design. Sheila restrained him with a precision that suggested rehearsal, her movements devoid of hesitation, her focus absolute. There was no chaos in her actions, no sign of uncertainty, only the execution of a decision that had been made long before he arrived. The room she confined him in was not improvised, it was constructed. Hidden behind the facade of an ordinary living space, it existed as a controlled environment where surveillance replaced trust, where isolation replaced connection. Cameras were positioned with calculated intent, ensuring that every movement, every expression, every attempt at resistance would be observed and recorded. For Sheila, this was not merely about containment. It was about dominance, about creating a reality where Deacon's autonomy was stripped away and replaced with her authority. He was no longer a partner, no longer an equal, he was an object within a system she controlled. Yet even as she secured her control over him, Sheila understood that this was only part of what needed to be done. Control, for her, extended beyond the immediate. It required influence over perception, over narrative, over the emotional responses of those connected to the situation. The message she sent to Taylor was crafted with the same precision as everything else, a blend of threat and ambiguity that was designed not only to inform, but to destabilize. It did not provide answers, it created questions. It did not confirm Deacon's fate, it suggested possibilities far worse than certainty. When Taylor received the message, the effect was immediate and profound. The words themselves were minimal, but the implication behind them was expansive, filling the space of her thoughts with fear, guilt, and urgency. The idea that Deacon's disappearance was not an accident, but an act connected directly to her, forced her into a psychological state where hesitation was no longer possible. Every instinct she possessed, both as someone who cared deeply and as someone trained to understand human behavior, told her that time was no longer a luxury. The situation was escalating, and with each passing moment, the risk increased. What made Taylor's position even more complex was the realization that she could not face this alone. The dynamics of the situation, the history between the individuals involved, the unpredictability of Sheila, all of it pointed to the necessity of collaboration, even with those she might not have chosen under different circumstances. Her decision to seek out Steffi was not born from comfort, but from necessity, from the understanding that survival often requires alliances that transcend personal history. For Steffi, the request was not unexpected, yet it carried with it a weight that could not be ignored. Her relationship with Taylor, layered with both love and conflict, placed her in a position where emotion and logic intersected in ways that made clear decision-making difficult. Yet the urgency of the situation cut through that complexity. The possibility that Deacon was being held, controlled, possibly harmed, reframed everything. This was no longer about past grievances or unresolved tensions. It was about action, about response, about confronting a threat that had already demonstrated its capacity for escalation. Their alliance, though fragile, was immediate. There was no time to negotiate the terms of their cooperation, no opportunity to address the underlying tensions that still existed between them. What mattered was the shared objective, the singular focus on locating Deacon before the situation deteriorated beyond recovery. Each brought something essential to the effort: Taylor's understanding of Sheila's psychological patterns, Steffi's determination, and strategic clarity. Together, they formed a response that neither could have executed alone. As they began to piece together the fragments of what had happened, the situation revealed itself to be more complex than a simple act of jealousy or revenge. Sheila's actions were not random. They were structured, intentional, part of a larger pattern that suggested long-term planning rather than impulsive reaction. The apartment, the hidden room, the surveillance system, all of it pointed to preparation, to a scenario that had been anticipated and designed for. This realization shifted the nature of the threat. It was no longer just about rescuing Deacon. It was about understanding the extent of Sheila's plan, the boundaries of her control, and the risks associated with confronting her directly. Every decision carried weight. every action the potential to escalate a situation that was already dangerously unstable. And at the center of it all, confined within a space designed to erase his agency, Deacon faced a reality that tested not only his physical endurance, but his psychological resilience. Isolation, surveillance, the constant awareness of being watched, these were tools designed to break down resistance, to reshape behavior, to enforce compliance. Yet beneath that pressure, something within him remained unyielding, a refusal to accept the narrative Sheila was trying to impose. The situation had moved beyond confrontation into something far more dangerous, a battle not just for control, but for identity, for autonomy, for the right to exist outside the confines of someone else's design. And as the lines between captor and captive, protector and threat, truth and manipulation continued to blur, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not a conflict that would resolve quietly. It was escalating. And the cost of failure would not be measured in misunderstandings or broken relationships, but in something far more permanent. The deeper they moved into Sheila's world, the more it became clear that this was never about a single act of jealousy or a moment of emotional instability. It was architecture, a carefully constructed system built on control, anticipation, and the quiet erosion of other people's autonomy. Every clue Taylor and Steffi uncovered did not simply point toward Deacon's location. It revealed the extent to which Sheila had been preparing for this moment long before any confrontation had taken place. The apartment was only the surface, a facade designed to appear ordinary, even inviting. Beneath it existed something far more calculated, a hidden structure that suggested Sheila had long ago accepted that love, for her, would never be mutual. It would have to be enforced. Inside the confined space where Deacon was being held, time lost its usual meaning. Without natural light, without any sense of external rhythm, his perception of hours began to blur into something indistinct and oppressive. The cameras mounted in the corners of the room were not just tools of surveillance. They were psychological instruments, constant reminders that privacy no longer existed, that every movement, every moment of weakness or resistance was being observed and recorded. Sheila did not need to be physically present to maintain control. Her absence was, in many ways, more powerful than her presence. It forced Deacon to confront not just her actions, but her mindset, the certainty that she believed this arrangement was justified, even necessary. At first, his resistance was instinctive, driven by anger and disbelief. He tested the boundaries of the room, the strength of the restraints, the possibility of escape. But as each attempt failed, the nature of his resistance began to shift. It became quieter, more internal, a refusal to let his identity be reshaped by the conditions imposed upon him. Sheila could control his movement, restrict his environment, but she could not fully dictate how he interpreted what was happening to him. That distinction, subtle but crucial, became the foundation of his endurance. He understood that survival in this context was not just physical, it was psychological. Sheila, observing from a distance, recognized this shift, and it unsettled her in ways she had not anticipated. She had expected defiance, even anger, but what she encountered instead was something more difficult to dismantle, a quiet resilience that did not rely on confrontation. For someone like Sheila, whose sense of power was rooted in visible reactions, in the ability to provoke, to dominate, to elicit fear or submission, this calm resistance presented a challenge. It forced her to escalate, not because she was losing control, but because she could not tolerate the possibility that her control was incomplete. Her visits to the room became more frequent, more deliberate, each interaction designed to push Deacon closer to the response she desired. She spoke not with rage, but with a distorted sense of logic, attempting to reframe reality in a way that justified her actions. In her mind, she was not imprisoning him. She was protecting what they had, preserving something she believed was being threatened by forces outside her control. Taylor, in this narrative, was not a person but an intrusion, an obstacle that needed to be removed for the sake of something greater. The more Deacon rejected this framing, the more Sheila's need to enforce it intensified. Outside that controlled environment, Taylor and Steffi found themselves navigating a different kind of confinement, one defined not by physical walls, but by uncertainty and time. Every lead they pursued seemed to open new questions rather than provide answers. The message Sheila had sent, though intentionally vague, carried markers that Taylor began to recognize. Patterns in language, subtle cues that hinted at emotional states, at underlying intentions. Taylor's understanding of Sheila was not just intellectual, it was experiential. She knew how Sheila thought, how she rationalized, how she escalated. That knowledge, while valuable, was also deeply unsettling because it meant she could anticipate just how far Sheila might be willing to go. Steffi approached the situation differently, her focus sharper, more action-oriented. Where Taylor analyzed, Steffi pushed forward, unwilling to allow fear to slow their progress. Yet, even she could not ignore the growing realization that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple kidnapping. This was not about leverage or negotiation. Sheila was not seeking something external: money, power, advantage. She was seeking control over a narrative, over a relationship, over a reality she refused to accept as it was. That made her unpredictable in a way that traditional threats were not. The breakthrough came not from a single discovery, but from the convergence of several small inconsistencies that, when viewed together, formed a pattern too precise to ignore. A delivery record that did not align with Sheila's known movements. A utility fluctuation in a section of the building that should have been unused. A faint signal detected by a device Steffi had insisted on using, one that suggested the presence of electronic surveillance equipment operating continuously. Individually, each detail could have been dismissed. Together, they pointed to something hidden in plain sight. As they closed in on the location, the emotional weight of what they might find began to settle over them. For Taylor, the fear was not just that Deacon might be harmed, but that she might be too late, that whatever Sheila had planned had already progressed beyond the point of reversal. For Steffi, the fear took a different form, the possibility that confronting Sheila directly would trigger a response that could not be contained, that the act of rescue might itself become the catalyst for something irreversible. Inside the hidden room, Deacon sensed the shift before he understood its cause. There was a subtle change in Sheila's behavior, a tension that had not been there before. Her movements were sharper, her focus more fragmented, as though something beyond her control was beginning to intrude on the carefully maintained structure she had built. She did not acknowledge it directly, but the signs were unmistakable. For the first time since his confinement began, Deacon saw something he had not expected to see: uncertainty. That uncertainty, small as it was, altered the balance between them. It introduced the possibility that her control, while extensive, was not absolute. And in that possibility, Deacon found something that had been absent until now, a sense that the situation, however dire, was not fixed, that it could still change. When the moment finally came, it did not arrive with clarity or control, but with chaos. The door to the hidden space, once a symbol of confinement, became the focal point of a confrontation that had been building from multiple directions. Taylor and Steffi, driven by urgency and instinct, moved forward with a determination that left no room for hesitation. Sheila, caught between her need to maintain control and the reality of losing it, was forced into a position she had not planned for, a reactive stance, where decisions had to be made in real time rather than executed according to a prearranged design. The collision of these forces, control and resistance, obsession and determination, created a moment where everything that had been carefully constructed began to fracture. And in that fracture, the true nature of each person involved was revealed, stripped of pretense, reduced to the core motivations that had driven them to this point. What followed would not be a simple resolution, nor a clean escape. It would be a reckoning, one shaped not just by what had been done, but by what each of them was willing to do next. And as the lines between victim and survivor, protector and aggressor, continued to blur, one truth became unavoidable.